한중일 철강인 여러분, 전 세계 철강인 여러분 반갑습니다. 저는 대한민국 서울의 스틸앤스틸의 서정은 대표입니다. 저는 오늘 제10회 아시아 스틸 포럼의 개회를 선언하고자 합니다. 아시아 스틸 포럼은 2010년 시작하여 지난 10년간 아시아 주요 도시에서 개최되어 왔습니다. 이제 아시아 스틸 포럼은 아시아를 대표하는 명실상부한 철강 컨퍼런스가 되었습니다. 저는 아시아 스틸 포럼의 10주년을 축하하기 위해서 오늘 이렇게 한복을 입었습니다. 한국 사람들은 결혼이나 명절일 때 축하하기 위해서 한복을 자주 입곤 합니다. 저도 오늘 이 아시아 스틸 포럼 10주년을 축하하기 위해서 특별히 한복을 입었습니다. 잘 어울리나 모르겠습니다. 조금 전 오프닝한 행사에서 여러분들은 과거 2010년 제1회 아시아 스틸 포럼의 영상물을 보셨습니다. 지금은 코로나19로 인해서 이런 영상의 제작이 불가능합니다. 또 한편 저는 개인적으로 우리 아시아 스틸 포럼이 2010년 제1회 아시아 스틸 포럼의 초심으로 돌아가야 될 필요가 있다는 생각에서 제작한 영상입니다. 이제 지난 10년간 아시아 스틸 포럼의 영상을 감상하시겠습니다. 지난 10년간 아시아 스틸 포럼은 한중일 공동의 노력이 없이는 불가능했을 겁니다. 특히 중국 마이스틸 주진웅 회장님과 일본 철강신문 이치아나기 사장님께 진심으로 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 지난 10년 아시아 스틸 포럼은 우리 한중일 공동의 노력의 산물입니다. 2020년 제10회 아시아 스틸 포럼은 온라인에서 웨비나로 진행되고 있습니다. 비대면으로 다소 불편한 점은 있지만 또 다른 한편으로 생각해보면 이 웨비나로 인해서 전 세계 철강인들이 아시아 스틸 포럼에 참여할 수 있다는 가능성도 있습니다. 저는 그래서 특히 이번 아시아 스틸 포럼에 전 세계 아시아 철강 산업에 관심이 많은 전 세계 철강인들을 초대하고자 합니다. 2020년 제10회 아시아 스틸 포럼은 한국, 중국, 일본에 더해서 대만 스틸넷까지 4개의 철강사가 공동으로 개최하고 있습니다. 오늘 11월 16일 월요일 오프닝 행사에서 이번 주말까지 5일간 아시아 스틸 포럼은 반복적으로 개최됩니다. 한중일 철강인 여러분들의 적극적인 참여를 부탁드립니다. 스틸앤스틸과 스틸델리는 2004년 창립되었습니다. 지난 17년간 저희는 철강인 여러분들의 많은 관심과 사랑을 받아왔습니다. 저도 개인적으로 너무나 행복했습니다. 이제 스틸앤스틸의 미래는 더 양질의 철강 정보와 지식을 축적하고 한국과 세계 철강 산업에 대한 새로운 시각을 끊임없이 제시하는 최고의 철강 전문가 집단이 되도록 노력하겠습니다. 오늘 제10회 아시아 스틸 포럼을 축하하기 위해서 많은 분들이 축하 영상을 보내오셨습니다. 저희들과 공동으로 아시아 스틸 포럼을 개최하고 있는 중국 마이스틸 주진홍 회장님의 축하 영상입니다.
上海钢联朱金红总裁由于不得已的原因，没能拍摄贺词视频，所以由스틸앤스틸代读朱总裁的贺词，请各位谅解。尊敬的各位海内外观众，女士们、先生们，大家上午好。金秋时节，丹桂飘香，在这充满丰收喜悦的日子里，隆重举行2020第10届亚洲钢铁论坛。在此，我谨代表主办方之一上海钢联电子商务股份有限公司，对历年会议的各位领导和海内外观众表示诚挚的欢迎和衷心的感谢。2020年是极其特殊的一年，我们经历了范围最广的突发公共卫生事件，举全球之力稳经济、保生产，全球钢铁业间贸易互通出现了不少变化，全球经济增长整体放缓，世界经贸体系面临诸多考验。2018年，亚洲的粗钢产量达到16亿吨，占据了全球总产量的 68%。 在全球范围内，目前有5820万吨钢铁产能处于建设中，并计划在2020年到2022年投产。目前正处于计划阶段，可能在这一时期启动的产能有2010万吨。如果目前正在进行或计划进行的所有项目最终实现亚洲和中东地区的炼钢产能，在今后几年可能会有相当大的增长。亚洲钢铁产业的发展正极大地影响着全球钢铁产业的格局。为及时让各位观众了解目前亚洲钢铁业形势，大家再度相聚。亚洲钢铁论坛就亚洲区域的经济发展与钢铁产业合作展开交流探讨意义。最后，再次感谢各位来宾对 ASF 亚洲钢铁论坛的长期大力支持，欢迎大家到上海钢联总部做客，预祝本次大会圆满成功，谢谢。最后，祝会议圆满成功。
the next. Let's innovate.
그 다음은 세계적으로 알려진 대표적인 철강 컨설팅사인 월드 스틸 다이내믹스의 창업자이신 피터마커스와 필립 앵글린 사장님의 축하 메시지입니다.
Good morning, everyone. This is Philip Englund, and CEO of World Steel Dynamics, and P.Marcus, managing partner and founder of World Steel Dynamics. And we would like to congratulate the organizers of the 10th Asia Steel Forum on a wonderful and successful event amidst these difficult times in 2020. With that, Peter is going to now share some of World Steel Dynamics' latest thoughts on both the long-term and the medium and short-term events that the steel industry globally is faced with. Peter?
Hi, so thank you, Phil, very much. I'm going to be commenting about some macroeconomic developments which are strongly impacting the steel industry. I have 3 comments there. Then discuss the industry's mandate to reduce CO2 substantially in the years ahead, which is a terrible threat to a number of the integrated companies, and then discuss with you the pricing outlook for the remainder of this year and next year. When it comes to the outlook for the macroeconomic developments, 2 groups are being left behind. Workers are left behind because technology will be replacing workers at a faster rate than the growth of economies can create new jobs. This is going to put a burden on many governments, more transfer payments to unemployed people. It will slow the global economy. Next, because of the advances in technology, it no longer is as attractive to build a new factory in an advanced country, in a developing nation with low wages, as in an advanced country. You build a plant in the United States, you have high labor productivity, low cost of components, great services, big markets, big subsidies. So the developing world is going to be left behind because of the advancement of technology. A third thought is we think the global economy will grow 2 to 2.5% a year through 2050. But at the same time, because of declining steel intensity, we think steel production in 2050 may be little changed. But because of at roughly 1.8 billion tons, but because of the growth of the obsolete scrap reservoir from 14 to 32 billion tons, and the growth of DRI, especially based on hydrogen, we're going to have 500 million tons of new metallics in a 1.8 billion ton industry. This scenario has similarities to what happened after the mid-50s. Now, regarding the steel industry's CO2 reduction mandate, the belief is widespread that man-made CO2 is adding to global warming, and many companies and governments are announcing strong measures to eliminate as much carbon as possible. An integrated steel company will produce about 2 tons of CO2 per ton of steel, while an EAF steelmaker may be 1.2 tons. The problem is that each ton of coal emits 2.3 tons of CO2 because 1 atom of carbon in the coal combines with 2 atoms of oxygen from the air. So we have this 37 billion tons of CO2 going into the air. Steel companies cannot lag in taking strong actions to eliminate as much carbon as possible from what they're producing, because otherwise they will be called environmentally unfit. They will be abandoned by investors. The leading company right now in this effort to mitigate the carbon problem is ArcelorMittal. If they take the route by which you generate hydrogen at low cost, go to put it into a DRI plant, to an electric arc furnace, they claim their costs in Europe would go up 50 to 80%. They'd have to spend 30 to 40 billion euros, and the government to create a clean environment with much more renewables as produced in terms of electricity. That's another 40 to 200 billion euros. If ArcelorMittal follows the smart carbon route, which is turning the CO2 which they can capture into products not containing carbon and or sequester it, the increase in cost is only 30 to 60%. Capital outlays are 15 to 25 billion, and the clean environment will cost the government between 15 and 165 billion euros of capital outlays. Now, when it comes to the outlook for the steel industry, right now with production down, the economy improving, the mood being more positive, we have a tightened steel supply. Hot roll band on the world market is roughly $530 a ton, up from $370 in about April this year. We've also had major price increases in Europe and the United States. We think we are currently in what's called a fair times environment. When you take our new pricing system of equilibrium prices, we think the equilibrium price in fair times is about $480, and the inherent price volatility is plus or minus $40 a ton. So 480 plus 40 is 520, the upper end of the price in fair times. We're now at 530. We think this is an indication that hot rolled band on the world market probably is overpriced. We think that next year steel demand globally will be less than it was in 2019 as the Chinese slow in their growth and the rest of the world has some decline. The problem is that capital spending by many industrial companies will be less next year because this year their balance sheets were damaged and they did very poorly, in many cases, on a profitability basis. So basically, if the industry can make the transition to good times next year, the equilibrium price would be $550. If they stay in fair times, it's $480. If they slip back to bad times, it's $420. So as we look at the various conditions, the oversupply, the competitiveness in the world market, we think that we are heading into a rough year next year. Thank you very much.
첨단 건축 기술의 결집으로 이루어진 초고층 초대형 빌딩. 그러나 눈에 보이는 화려함이 건축물의 안전을 보장하지는 않습니다. 중요한 것은 보이지 않는 곳에 있습니다. 건축물의 기본이자 중심인 골조. 골조는 건축물의 핵심입니다. 만약 골조가 안전하지 않은 건축물에 예상치 못한 큰 지진이 발생한다면 어떠한 일이 일어날까요? 지진이 시작되었습니다. 땅이 흔들림에 따라 건축물도 이에 반응하여 흔들리기 시작합니다. 유리가 사방으로 위험하게 쏟아지고 가구가 넘어지며 물건들이 떨어집니다. 순간 강력한 진동에 의해 골조에 큰 변형이 나타났습니다. 왼쪽에는 H코어 강제를 적용한 강기둥 약보 골조이고 오른쪽에는 일반 강제를 적용한 약기둥 강보 골조입니다. 일반 강제를 적용한 구조물은 하부층의 기둥들에 소성 힌지가 발생하여 구조물이 심하게 뒤틀리며 끊어지기 시작합니다. 반면 H코어를 적용한 구조물은 구조 구제에 부분적인 충격은 있지만 안정적으로 건축물을 지탱합니다. 왜 이런 차이를 보이게 되었는지 전문가에게 물어보았습니다.
일반 강제를 적용한 건축물의 경우 설계자의 의도와는 다르게 보의 강도가 기둥의 강도보다 크게 되어 기둥이 먼저 항복하였고 이에 따라 특정 층이나 전체 건물의 붕괴가 야기될 수 있는 상황이 발생하였습니다. H코어는 일반 강제와는 다르게 엄격한 품질 관리와 강도 관리를 통해 설계자의 의도를 정확히 파악하여 내진 성능을 높일 수 있는 제품이라고 생각합니다.
지진에 강한 철 H코어는 내진용 형강, 내진용 철근, 내진용 후판, 내진용 강관 등 다양한 제품 포트폴리오를 갖추고 있습니다. 탁월한 에너지 흡수 능력과 남극과 같은 극저온 환경에서도 깨지지 않는 충격 인성을 비롯해 건축물 구조 안전의 품질을 향상시키는 뛰어난 용접 성능까지 가지고 있는 H코어. 지진에 견디는 최고의 기술 H코어는 안전한 건물의 중심이자 안전한 대한민국의 중심입니다. 지진의 강한 철 H코어.
감사합니다. 축하 메시지와 함께 월드 스틸 다이나믹스가 바라보는 코로나 이후의 세계 철강산업 전망은 매우 한국인들에게 유익한 자료가 될 것으로 생각됩니다. 이제 마지막 축하 메시지는 한국철강협회 이민철 부회장님의 축하 메시지입니다.
먼저 10번째 아시아 스틸 포럼 개최를 진심으로 축하합니다. 그리고 지난 10여 년간 아시아 스틸 포럼의 성공적인 운영을 위해서 노력해 주신 관계자분들의 헌신에 진심으로 감사의 말씀을 전합니다. 지금 한국과 아시아와 그리고 글로벌 철강 산업이 직면한 도전은 지난 10년 전에 아시아 스틸 포럼이 창설되었을 때와는 사실상 비교가 되지 않는다고 판단을 하고 있습니다. 과거에는 철강 산업의 성장이 주요한 도전이었다면 이제는 또 새로운 도전, 즉 친환경화, 그리고 수요 정책, 공급 과잉, 또 디지털라이제이션이다라는 그런 도전에 직면하여 이제는 철강 산업이 지속 가능성에 좀 더 초점을 맞춰야 되지 않냐라는 그런 판단을 하고 있습니다. 더군다나 최근에 코로나 바이러스 영향으로 인해서 이 철강 산업의 생산, 수요, 그리고 교역 패턴에도 큰 영향을 미치지 않을까라는 그런 판단을 하고 있습니다. 이러한 도전을 극복하는 데 있어서 아시아 스틸 포럼의 보다 적극적인 그리고 건설적인 역할을 기대합니다. 제가 좋아하는 영어 문구가 있습니다. Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. 지난 10년간 아시아 스틸 포럼은 아시아 철강 업계와 또 관계자분들의 Coming together, Keeping together는 성공적으로 그 역할을 수행했다고 판단을 하고 있습니다. 앞으로 아시아 철강 포럼이 새로운 도전에 직면한 이 철강 산업의 지속 가능성을 좀 더 올리기 위해서 이제는 워킹 투게더의 역할도 이제 수행해 주시기를 간곡히 바랍니다. 한국철강협회는 아시아 그리고 글로벌 철강 산업의 지속 가능한 발전을 위해서 모든 협력과 노력을 아끼지 않겠습니다. 감사합니다.
우리가 세상에 내놓은 것들은 눈에 잘 띄지 않습니다. 땅과 바다, 건물과 다리, 그리고 우리의 일상생활 뒤에서 말없이 자리를 지킬 뿐입니다. 철, 평범한 삶을 지탱해주는 가장 근원의 재료. 우리는 철을 만드는 사람입니다. 세상의 기초를 만든다는 자부심이 우리를 가슴뛰게 합니다. 우리가 만든 철강제가 기본의 표준을 끌어올리고 풍요의 수준을 높여가길 바랍니다. 그것이 우리가 생각하는 철의 역할입니다. 우리는 철을 만드는 사람입니다.
한국철강산업을 대표해서 아시아 스틸 포럼을 축하해 주신 이민철 부회장님께 감사의 말씀을 드리고자 합니다. 이제 오늘 마지막 하이라이트 순서입니다. 세계 철강협회 월드 스틸 어소시에이션의 한내희 박사님의 하이라이트 스피치입니다. 한내희 박사님의 하이라이트 스피치 주제는 코로나 이후 세계 철강 산업의 변화입니다.
First of all, I would like to congratulate the 10th anniversary of the Asia Steel Forum and thank the organizers for inviting me to speak today. As we all know, we are going through an unexpected and unprecedented shock. We are not out of the wood yet, but at the same time, we know that after such a big shock, we may not go back to the same place as we were before the pandemic. It might still be a bit too early to tell exactly what kind of changes are forthcoming to our industry, but today I'll try to share my preliminary thoughts on this topic. First, I will talk about the short-term impact of COVID-19 on steel demand based on our latest SRO. To set the scene, let's look at how the global economy is doing. As we can see from the graph on the top, since June, the GDP forecasts have been revised up for many countries, except for India and Japan. Now, global GDP will fall by 4.8%, much less than expected earlier. Emerging countries suffer relatively more from the pandemic, with inadequate medical system, lack of strong fiscal stimulus, and collapse in commodity prices and tourism. But already in August, recovery momentum was weakening for some countries, and the prospect for 2021 remains subdued. What hindered the recovery is uncertainty, continued social distancing, fading of government stimulus, worsened corporate balance sheets, and high unemployment. Further, the rising possibility of a second wave will suppress the recovery momentum and increase downside risk. Let's look at SRO now. Our latest SRO suggests that in 2020, global steel demand will contract by 2.4%. It's much less than what we projected in our June forecast, which looked at a fall of 6.3%. But we must note that the contraction of global steel demand has been mitigated by China, whose steel demand is expected to grow by 8% this year. The global figure, excluding China, shows a decline of 13.3% in 2020. For 2021, we expect a partial recovery of 4.1% growth, and the global steel demand will reach about 1.8 billion tons. This means global steel demand in 2021 will exceed that of 2019, but this is due to China. In the rest of the world, steel demand will not return to the 2019 level for both developed and developing economies. This slide shows regional forecasts. We can see that steel demand will see a deep contraction across the developed and developing regions in 2020. Only China and Turkey will have a positive growth this year. Some developing regions, such as Middle East, Africa, and emerging Asia, will show contraction as deep as developed economies. So steel demand in developed economies will fall by 14.4% in 2020, and in developing economies by 12.3%. In India, steel demand will fall by 20%, reflecting the severity of the lockdown measures in April and May, but it will recover fast. The Middle East region will see a contraction deeper than developed economies, with a subdued outlook for recovery due to the fall in oil prices. In Latin America, the impact has been high across the continent. Besides, the pandemic will interrupt the recent reforms and worsen social stability to leave a long-lasting scar to the region's viability. We can also note that recovery in developing countries will be stronger than developed economies, led by the emerging Asian countries like India and ASEAN. Now, let's spend a moment comparing the impact of the COVID-19 crisis with that of the global financial crisis. We can see that the impact on global steel demand from the COVID-19 shock is much smaller on an annual basis, even though global GDP will fall much more this year than during the financial crisis. Among the steel-using sectors, the automotive and machinery industries are the hardest hit in both crises, but the impact on the machinery sector from the COVID-19 crisis is much smaller than the financial crisis. If we compare the impact by region, China's role in boosting global steel demand is much weaker this time than in 2009. For developed economies, steel demand is less affected by the COVID-19 crisis than the global financial crisis. But this is from an already low level, which had not fully recovered from the financial crisis. Besides, recovery in 2021 will be weaker than what we saw in 2009. Steel demand in developing economies, excluding China, is expected to fall slightly more in this crisis. Still, the picture is quite different across countries. India and MENA, which remained resilient during the global financial crisis, are feeling the impact much acutely this time. Last point, emerging economies rebounded strongly from the 2009 dip in 1 year. This time, recovery in 2021 will be much weaker. This graph shows how the past two crises have changed the regional picture of steel demand. We can see that global financial crisis has brought a marked jump in China's share at the cost of the developed economies. With the COVID-19 crisis, China's share will jump again to 57% of world steel demand. To summarize, despite upward revisions due to a stronger than expected post-lockdown recovery, steel demand in 2020 will contract significantly in most parts of the world except China. Emerging economies are much more affected by the COVID-19 crisis compared to the financial crisis. The recovery in 2021 will be only partial, and the emerging Asian countries will lead the recovery. The damage to some emerging economies will likely have a long-term effect, especially for Latin America. Our current forecast faces downside risks because of the threat of second waves, especially in Europe and the US. However, fiscal stimulus may affect the outcome as well. Lastly, the recovery from the pandemic will accompany structural changes for the steel industry. So now I will turn to long-term consequences of the pandemic. As the pandemic is going on longer than expected, most of us have started to wonder how the world will change after the pandemic. So let's first see the major megatrends that have been ongoing before the pandemic. On the social and the political front, we have seen increasing political polarization, nationalism, and rising inequality. We have also seen the trend of aging population and urbanization in emerging economies that have important implications for steel demand. Also, society has been facing increasing pressure to tackle climate change. In the international scene, we have seen a backlash against globalization, shifting global power, and great decoupling between China and the US. This has led to a weakening of global institutions and rising protectionism. On the technology side, digitization and automation have been driving changes in every aspect of our lives and the economies. These megatrends have been directly and indirectly driving structural changes in the steel industry and our customer sectors. On the production side, CO2 mitigation and smart manufacturing have been the major theme underpinning corporate strategies of steel companies. In the global steel market, growth was becoming slower as China's fast growth era was coming to an end. At the same time, regional growth driver has been shifting to Asia, with India and ASEAN emerging a fast-growing region after China. In the steel-using sectors, new structural forces like electrification, automation, and sharing economy were driving the transformation of the auto industry. In the construction sector, urbanization and infrastructure development in the emerging economies, smart city, and energy transformation have been key factors driving the industry. So, how will the pandemic change the world and the megatrends? During the lockdown in April, I listened to many experts on this issue, and the most candid answer was, I don't know. Nowadays, people started to realize that actually the pandemic's impact would be to accelerate the existing megatrends, such as deglobalization, more remote working, and online shopping, to mention just a few. At the same time, some trends could reverse, and new trends might emerge, depending on how society reacts to the pandemic. For example, the populist governments may lose power because of the failure to handle the pandemic properly. In my view, the biggest social impact will be a jump in teleactivities and a shift in people's values and preferences after experiencing the pandemic. This will bring slow but broad changes to our society. The second important aspect of the pandemic's impact would be a focus on resilience from business and consumer sides. Companies will put increased efforts for diversification and regionalization of supply chains, but it may not mean a total withdrawal from global supply chains. Consumers may change their spending patterns and save more. This could in turn mean lower productivity and slower economic growth. Also, the pandemic will affect growth potential of some countries more profoundly than others. On the political side, we may see a strong role of government in ensuring its citizens' well-being. Globalization will change its shape in the new world, but nobody or no country can walk away from globalization. We will see further changes in international relations, which were based on the liberal world order. Now, I would like to share my thoughts on the possible impacts of the pandemic on the steel industry, building on the discussion so far. Let's start with the steel-using sectors. We are likely to see a shift in demand structure in the steel-using sectors. In the automotive sector, the transition toward electric vehicles will continue. At the same time, changes in urban mobility patterns will affect the demand for cars versus other types of transportation. There will be some supply chain alignments as well. In the construction sector, increased remote working and social distancing will change urbanization patterns, affecting urban design and demand for residential and commercial spaces. This will lead to a shift in construction demand and steel intensity of construction. Also, with the rising environmental pressure, the energy sector investment will shift away from oil and gas. How will demand growth potential change? It's more likely that the pandemic will slow steel demand growth further due to slower economic growth. It will take at least a couple of years for most countries' economies to return to the pre-COVID level. Moreover, some sectors may never come back to the previous level. Also, the pandemic may decrease productivity for various reasons. At the same time, the broader changes in society will affect the steel intensity of GDP as well. That is, how much steel is required to achieve GDP growth. The effect will depend very much on how emerging economies' investment potential gets affected by the pandemic and how the new urban planning and the green transition will affect the steel demand in the construction sector. It is difficult to tell exactly which direction it will go, but could well be on the negative side. The shift in global steel demand toward Asia will continue as China and other Asian countries are ahead in recovering from the pandemic, while other emerging economies might be structurally damaged by the pandemic. With the rising government's role in the economy and the focus on national resilience, the steel industry will face more trade protectionism. Also, near or reshoring of steel-using sectors, even though we are not sure yet to what extent this will take place, it will affect indirect steel trade patterns. Finally, more focus on environmental protection means increased pressure on the steel industry to reduce CO2 emission. To conclude, there is still a lot of uncertainty about the pandemic, but it will certainly bring a far-reaching transformation of our society. Likewise, even though the exact shape of the steel industry's structural change is yet to be identified, it is likely to involve a shift in steel demand patterns and growth potential, region and sector-wise. Structural changes will always involve challenges, but the steel industry has historically been good at overcoming challenges. There is also a reason to be optimistic. Since steel will always be a part of the solution in this transition, the industry will also see new opportunities along the way. Thank you for your attention. I wish you a successful conclusion of the conference.
제10회. Challenging ourselves. It is the power that transforms possibilities into new opportunities. 제10회 takes on challenges and works through innovations to realize the infinite potential value of steel. Creating new values. That is just another step in the process of becoming the best. 제10회 has set the world-class quality standard by continuously developing innovative manufacturing processes and building optimum automation systems. The burning passion of 제10회 is boiling at 1,600 degrees Celsius.
한혜희 박사님 감사합니다. 큰 시각으로 세계 철강 산업을 바라보는 관점이 한국 철강인들에게 큰 시사점을 주시는 것 같습니다. 2009년 세계 금융위기와의 비교, 환경규제, 통상, 정부의 역할 등은 참으로 의미 있는 내용이 아닐 수 없습니다. 한혜희 박사님께 다시 한번 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 이것으로 제10회 아시아 스틸 포럼의 첫째 날 행사를 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 내일부터 4일간 계속되고 있는 각 세션별 발표에도 국내외 철강인 여러분들의 적극적인 참여를 부탁드립니다. 한중일 철강인 여러분, 세계 철강인 여러분, 2020 제10회 아시아 스틸 포럼이 유익한 시간이 되시길 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
SEA CSS has manufactured stainless steel as well as other high value-added specialty steel products, including tool steel, carbon and alloy steel, and nickel alloy. With our less than 0.1 millimeter precision controllable RSM, DST, which minimizes mechanical property deviation via heat treatments and other special equipment.
우리는 세아 창원 특수왕입니다.
These are the core values of SEA CSS. SEA CSS.
달구고 두드려 더 단단하게. 그 단단함이 일생을 더 풍요롭게. 동국산업은 철의 생활에 편리함을 함께 녹입니다. 뛰어난 품질, 무한한 가능성을 바탕으로 동국산업은 아름답고 안전하게 세상을 지탱하고 바꿉니다. 세상에 없던 새로운 철을 끊임없이 발견해 나가는 50년 노하우를 통한 세계 최고의 냉연 특수강 전문기업 동국산업. 오늘도 우리는 철강 신세기를 열어나가고 있습니다. 동국산업은 철의 강인함과 안전을 생각하는 따뜻함으로 언제나 우리 삶 아주 가까운 곳에서 함께하고 있습니다. 동국산업은 앞으로도 철의 영역을 뛰어넘는 다양한 기술 개발과 도전으로 새로운 기업 가치를 만들어 나갈 것입니다.